My parents moved my ex-stalker into their house because he just took love too far, but karma struck when the homeowners association forced them to sell for sheltering a convicted stalker. I'm 26, and this whole disaster started about 8 months ago, when I finally broke up with my ex-boyfriend, Toby, who's 28. Yes, we were together for almost 3 years, and yes, looking back now, I can see all the red flags I ignored because I was in love or whatever foolish reason people give themselves. I think I'm a little cynical about love at this point. Our relationship was never physically violent, but you don't need bruises for a relationship to be toxic. He would show up at my job unannounced just to check on me. He'd go through my phone when I was in the shower. He'd question every friend I had and criticize everything, what I wore, what I ate, how I spent my time. When I tried to tell him that I felt suffocated, he said he only did it because he loved me so much that he couldn't help but want to be involved in every part of my life. The breaking point came when he secretly installed a tracking app on my phone. My friend discovered it after I noticed my phone was running weirdly slow. It was an old phone, add a few apps and it's done for, but when she checked it for me, sure enough, there it was. I knew it was Toby. He denied it at first, then finally admitted it, saying it was for my safety, in case something happened to me. And that if I had nothing to hide, I shouldn't be upset. That was the moment I escaped the relationship, because I couldn't take it anymore. But ending things with Toby was easier said than done. Every time I tried to break up with him, he'd show up with elaborate apologies, expensive gifts, or threats to hurt himself. He camped outside my apartment for hours, left dozens of tearful voicemails, and somehow always knew where I was going. I started staying at my friend's place because I was scared to be alone. My parents knew we'd broken up, but they'd always liked Toby, because with them he was charming. He brought my mom flowers, helped my dad in the garden. When I explained why I'd ended it, they said things like, "Maybe he's not so wrong. A man can be intense when he really loves the right woman. You should feel flattered, not every woman finds a man who loves her that much." Things stayed bad for a while. Even though I'd made it clear I didn't want him near me, he kept showing up at my job more and more often. I work in a small company, so my boss quickly realized something was off. Toby would come in claiming he needed to drop something off, or that we'd forgotten lunch plans. I told my boss the truth, and she was understanding, but warned that if he kept showing up, she'd call the police. That's exactly what happened 2 weeks later. Toby arrived around 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, demanding to speak to me. When the receptionist told him I was in a meeting, he pushed past her and barged into the conference room, where I was presenting to a client. He started yelling that I'd been ignoring his calls, that I was being unreasonable, that we needed to talk right now. My boss called 911 while my coworkers tried to get him out. Police arrived within 10 minutes and arrested Toby for trespassing and disturbing the peace. I was shaking and crying, terrified and humiliated. The officers took detailed statements. When I told them about the tracking app, the constant appearances, and the harassment, they encouraged me to file a formal stalking complaint. The next day, I spent hours at the police station with a victim advocate, documenting everything Toby had done. Call logs, hundreds of texts, photos of gifts he left at my door, screenshots of fake accounts he'd used to spy on me, and witness statements. The detective said Toby's behavior definitely met the legal definition of stalking, and that they'd be filing charges. They strongly recommended a restraining order, which I applied for that same afternoon. The court immediately granted a temporary protective order, requiring Toby to stay 150 meters away from me, my home, my job, and any other place I regularly went. And this is where my parents stepped into the nightmare. Toby got out on bail, and called my parents, crying, saying how sorry he was and how he just needed a place to stay while he sorted things out. Apparently, his landlord had a no tenants with criminal charges clause, so he couldn't stay there anymore. Without consulting me, my parents invited him to stay in their guest room. I found out 3 days later, when my mom called asking why I wasn't answering Toby's calls and suggested I at least hear him out. She said he was clearly devastated and just wanted to make amends. When she mentioned that he was staying with them, I lost it. My dad got on the phone to tell me it was time to drop the charges and fix this. He said they could act as intermediaries, that Toby had explained everything, that it was all a misunderstanding, and that he only acted that way because I was being difficult. My mom said, "Toby seems genuinely sorry. You should see his face. I think if you just sit down with him for a few hours, you could work things out." I told them to get him out of their house immediately, but they kept interrupting, defending him. My dad said I was being dramatic, that men are supposed to fight for the women they love. My mom said Toby had shown them sweet messages and thoughtful gifts, and that she couldn't understand why I was being so cold and unforgiving. The call ended when I hung up, after my father accused me of ruining a good man's life over a typical relationship spat. I called my lawyer right away. She explained that because my parents' house wasn't specifically listed in the restraining order, Toby technically wasn't violating it by staying there. However, she said we could request a modification to include their address, especially since they were enabling his harassment. So I went ahead with it and sent my parents a certified letter, giving them 48 hours to remove Toby before I took legal action. Within an hour, my mom called, hysterical, accusing me of doing to them what I'd done to poor Toby. My dad texted that they wouldn't throw him out because of my latest tantrum, and that if I wanted to get lawyers involved, that was my choice. But they wouldn't abandon someone in need just because I was being stubborn. The hearing went exactly as my lawyer predicted. The judge reviewed the evidence, Toby's stalking, my parents knowingly housing him despite the order, and their repeated attempts to pressure me to talk to him. She granted the modification without hesitation. Police served Toby that same afternoon, and also notified my parents. Meaning they could face legal consequences if they allowed him back in their home. They called that night, this time scared rather than angry. My mom was crying, saying she hadn't realized it was so serious. My dad was quieter, admitting they'd maybe made a mistake. But even then, they didn't fully get it, still insisting this was just relationship drama that could be fixed with communication and compromise. I told them Toby's behavior was criminal harassment, that I feared for my safety, and that by sheltering him, they were enabling something dangerous, maybe even deadly. For 3 weeks, I didn't hear from any of them. Toby found another place to stay, and for the first time in ages, I started to feel like maybe I could move on. Then my mom called again, at first just to check on me. She seemed to be trying to understand my perspective, even apologized for not taking Toby's behavior seriously. But last week, her real reason became clear. She called Sunday night, crying, saying that their homeowners association, HOA, had sent a legal notice about the police activity at their address. Because the police had come to serve the modified restraining order and remove Toby. The HOA had opened an investigation into whether my parents were operating an illegal boarding house or violating neighborhood bylaws. The HOA demanded documentation of Toby's stay, threatened fines for occupancy violations, and warned that ongoing legal issues could result in liens or even a forced sale of their home. They'd already hired a lawyer, which cost thousands they didn't have. My mom begged me to call my lawyer and ask her to lift the restriction on their address, so they could show the HOA that the legal issues were resolved. I was stunned. I explained that a restraining order isn't something you can switch on and off. It exists to protect me from someone who'd been arrested for stalking me. My mom started sobbing, saying they were going to lose their house. That the HOA fines and legal fees were more than they could afford. She said Toby was staying on the other side of town and hadn't bothered me since the modification, which proved he'd learned his lesson. When I explained that 3 weeks of following a court order didn't erase months of stalking, she said they'd already done what I wanted, and that now this was just pure vengeance. But the point is, I had to fight to get him out of their house, when normal parents should have made that decision the moment I told them my ex was stalking me. My dad was more direct this time. He said, "If you really cared about your family, you'd work with us to fix this." Why? Because he believes that if they spend too much money on lawyers and a forced sale of the house, since the market isn't great right now, they'll have less money to leave me as an inheritance. Lovely logic, right? But honestly, there's nothing to think about here. The restraining order exists because Toby stalked me to the point that I was afraid to go to work or be alone. My parents are having problems with the homeowners association because they chose to house my stalker after his arrest, knowing full well there was a restraining order in place. My lawyer was very clear. Modifying the order would be both legally and personally dangerous. Stalking cases often include periods where perpetrators appear to have moved on, only to escalate later. Every protection we've put in place has a purpose. Weakening those protections would only make things worse. Toby could see any leniency as a chance to manipulate the situation, maybe even as a first step to getting the restrictions lifted altogether. And honestly, I don't even know if my parents would let him back into their home once the restriction was removed. My lawyer also said that even if I wanted to modify it, it wouldn't be simple. I'd have to file a new motion, attend another hearing, and potentially face Toby and his attorney. The judge would want to understand why I felt safe enough to remove protections that had been granted for good reason. Which would make it seem like I no longer feared him. That's absolutely not true. More importantly, removing my parents' address from the order wouldn't necessarily solve their HOA problem anyway, since the documented police activity had already taken place. So what my parents are asking of me is impossible. Because the consequences of their own actions can't just be erased. Honestly, I don't feel guilty at all. But maybe some people will think that since they're my parents, I should at least try something. Update 1. Thank you to everyone for the concern, but don't worry about me. I have good friends, a solid lawyer, and the police are actually doing their job, something I didn't expect. One new development is that I contacted my parents' neighbor to get a clearer picture of what was really happening, since until now I'd only heard their version. She told me that the police activity had definitely been noticed, especially since it happened twice within a few weeks. Several residents had complained to the HOA about criminal activity and suspicious people, specifically mentioning my parents' address. So the HOA launched an investigation, not only for covenant violations, but also to see whether my parents had been subletting the property without permission, which would violate both HOA rules and the terms of their mortgage. What I hadn't realized was that Toby had been introducing himself to neighbors as my parents' new tenant, not a temporary guest. He told several people he was renting the guest room long-term. Neighbors saw him coming and going at all hours, bringing friends over, acting like he lived there permanently. So when the police came to serve the modified restraining order and remove him, it looked to everyone like the authorities were evicting a problem tenant for criminal behavior. The neighbor also mentioned that Toby had made several people uncomfortable even before the police incident. He approached multiple women in the neighborhood asking about me, whether they'd seen me visiting lately, if I was dating someone new. People found his questions creepy and invasive, especially because he introduced himself as my ex-boyfriend trying to make things right. That confirmed it. Toby had been using my parents' house as a base to keep stalking me and gather information about my life. It also explained why the HOA was taking such a hard line. From their point of view, my parents had been harboring someone engaged in criminal harassment and making residents feel unsafe. Meanwhile, my parents have been calling me multiple times a day, begging me to reconsider. My mom left a voicemail saying they've already spent over $5,000 in legal fees fighting the HOA's demands. And that their lawyer said their best chance was to prove there's no ongoing criminal activity at their property. My dad alternates between guilt and anger. In one call, he said he was disappointed in the person I'd become. That the daughter he raised would never let her parents lose their home over something so insignificant. In another, he said, "If you really thought Toby was dangerous, you should have warned us before letting him stay here." Of course, I did warn them. They had every opportunity to make the right choice before things went this far. They knew Toby had been arrested for stalking me, and they knew there was a restraining order in place. I even sent them a certified letter, giving them 48 hours to remove him before I took legal action. And they still did nothing. And now they're drowning in their own mess. There are easily a dozen messages where I explained Toby's behavior, asked for their support, and warned them about the consequences of letting him stay. Through all of this, my parents haven't asked me once how I'm doing, or if I feel safe. They're not worried about my safety, they're worried about their house. It's hard to say this as a daughter, but they didn't care before, and they don't care now. They only need me so they don't keep losing money. Yesterday, I got a call from Toby's friend, Nick, who said Toby had asked him to reach out to me to apologize and to beg me to reconsider modifying the restraining order, so my parents wouldn't lose their home. Nick said Toby understood his behavior was inappropriate, that he was in therapy, and just wanted to make things right. I told Nick that Toby is forbidden to contact me directly or indirectly through third parties under the terms of the restraining order. And that his call could be considered a violation, meaning he himself could get into legal trouble for getting involved. Nick sounded surprised and apologized, saying he wouldn't contact me again. I reported the contact to my lawyer. Toby keeps trying to manipulate the situation and get around the order. And this latest attempt clearly has my parents' fingerprints all over it, since the request was so specific. Which only proves that removing the restriction would be the worst possible idea. And that my parents deserve every consequence they're facing. If they still haven't grasped the seriousness of all this, then maybe moving out of their home and paying more legal fees will finally make them understand. I don't want to reason with them anymore, let money reason for me. Update 2. Last week, early in the morning, a detective called me asking if I could come down to the station for an update on Toby's case. I didn't know what to expect, they'd never called me for something like that before. At the station, the detective explained that they'd received a call from Toby's current roommate, James, who had become increasingly uncomfortable with Toby's behavior and had contacted the police after finding some disturbing items among his belongings. James had let Toby stay in his guest room as a favor, but almost immediately noticed strange behavior. Toby spent hours on his laptop, looking at my social media profiles and photos, printing pages and organizing them into folders. James overheard Toby on phone calls where he was clearly talking about me, about my routine, and asking people for updates on where I'd been seen. The breaking point came when James was helping Toby move some boxes and accidentally spilled a shopping bag. Inside were dozens of printed photos of me, including recent ones taken without my knowledge. There were handwritten notes tracking my schedule, maps marking my apartment and workplace, and what looked like detailed plans to approach me in various locations. When James confronted Toby, he got agitated and defensive, saying he was only doing this to clear his name, to prove himself and get the restraining order lifted. When James told him that the material looked like evidence of stalking, Toby became angry and accused him of betraying him like everyone else. That night, James overheard Toby talking about contacting me despite the order. He said Toby wanted to explain his side directly, that everyone else was keeping us apart unnecessarily, and that he'd find a way to make me understand that we belonged together. James said Toby sounded increasingly unhinged and disconnected from reality. He waited until Toby left the next morning, then called the police. When the detective searched Toby's room, they found even more disturbing evidence than what the roommate had seen. They discovered a detailed journal where Toby recorded his thoughts about me, our past relationship, and his plans to win me back. The detective showed me excerpts, and reading them made my stomach turn. Toby had written fantasies in which, after explaining his side, full of delusional logic, I would beg him to take me back. He'd outlined plans for us to marry, have children, and had even written down names for the kids. He kept a list of my friends, highlighting names he thought I might date or form a relationship with, along with probabilities of that happening. The most chilling part was his theories about why I'd gotten the restraining order. Toby was convinced that my friends and my lawyer had manipulated me into believing he was dangerous, and that if he could just get me alone, away from their influence, I'd realize they were lying out of jealousy of our love. He'd made detailed plans to approach me without technically violating the order, researching the exact distance limits and mapping routes that would let him be near me but just outside the restricted range. He also wrote about using other people to deliver messages or gather information for him. As the entries went on, they became increasingly erratic and obsessive, to the point of incoherence. In the past few days, I've thought a lot about what could have happened if this hadn't been discovered. Honestly, I don't know how it might have ended. In a way, I owe James my life. Even the detective believes he may have prevented something terrible. With this new evidence, prosecutors have filed additional stalking charges. And Toby was arrested again that same morning. This is a serious violation that could mean actual prison time. The detective said Toby's behavior likely escalated because his support system, meaning my parents, was cut off. Stalkers don't usually stop when everyone turns against them, they intensify. Given the new evidence, the DA's office will seek aggravated charges and possibly a prison sentence instead of probation. I left the station feeling completely overwhelmed, and more frightened than I've been since this all began. Because at this point, this isn't just a restraining order anymore. He's now facing criminal charges. And could finally be locked away for a long time. But at the same time, this is no longer just a restraining order. My ex is completely unhinged. I honestly don't know what he might do if they don't keep him locked up. I don't even know what his ultimate goal is anymore. So far, the police and the courts have been doing their jobs. But until something more concrete happens, I can't relax. I've had to increase my security in several ways that I'd rather not detail here. Because I've started to think he might actually be reading this. It sounds paranoid, but after that meeting with the detective, nothing seems too extreme when it comes to Toby. Edit. Yes, I've changed a few things in my story, names, for instance. But my ex knows everything about me and he's obsessed. If he ever came across these posts, he could very easily figure out who I'm talking about. Update 3. My parents' next-door neighbor called me yesterday morning with some new information. She asked if I'd heard what happened the night before at my parents' house. I hadn't spoken to them in a while. So her tone turning serious immediately made my stomach drop. She told me there had been police cars and even fire trucks outside my parents' house until nearly midnight. Because of some kind of incident involving property damage. Call it instinct, experience, or whatever. But even before she gave me the details, I already knew it had to be Toby. I hung up and called my parents right away. My mother answered, clearly in a bad mood, which told me it must have been serious. They hadn't slept all night and were exhausted. Then she told me everything. Apparently, Toby had somehow been released on bail again. I still don't know how. The detective had told me he'd be held without bail. But that depends on the judge. Somehow, by 10 p.m., he was standing at my parents' door. Drunk and completely out of control. My mom said he started by pounding on the door with his fists, screaming for them to let him in. When my parents refused and shouted through the door that they were calling the police, he snapped. Instead of leaving, he went around to the backyard and started destroying things. He threw patio chairs at the windows, shattering several panes, smashed garden decorations, ripped out solar lights, and overturned planters. He was completely out of his mind. My father, in his stubbornness, tried to go outside to confront him. But Toby shoved him to the ground without hesitation. My dad fell onto the concrete, scraping his hands and knees. My mom ran to call 911, dragging my father back inside. By that time, Toby had moved to the front of the house and was throwing rocks at the living room window, cracking it so badly it looked like a spider web. The police arrived within minutes. And by then half the neighborhood was awake, watching from their porches and windows. They arrested Toby on the spot. And this time booked him for breaking and entering, vandalism, and assault. My mom said there was no real struggle. He was too consumed by his drunken rage to resist. But my mother had left something on the stove in the kitchen. And amid all the chaos Toby caused, one of the curtains caught fire. That's why the fire department had to come. My mother broke down crying over the phone as she told me all this. Not just because of the chaos, but because the kitchen was ruined. And so much of the house was damaged. But this was exactly the kind of harassment I'd been trying to escape from. And the kind my parents had invited back into our lives. She apologized for not believing me before. For not seeing the warning signs. And yes, I told her that I hadn't seen them all either back then. But there hadn't been a restraining order then. Which is a pretty bright warning sign if there ever was one. So I told her that I was glad she finally saw my ex for what he really was. But that it was far too late. And their delay had completely destroyed our relationship. My father also tried to apologize. But my response hasn't changed. No matter how sorry they are, it doesn't undo what they did. The irony is that this horrifying incident also ended up solving their problem with the homeowners association. For weeks, the HOA had them cornered, threatening fines and investigations for harboring Toby in their house. They'd been accused of knowingly sheltering a criminal and allowing illegal activity in the neighborhood. But after this incident, with police reports and witnesses from the neighborhood, it became clear they had to go. That very afternoon, the HOA held a special meeting to vote on it. The decision must have been easy, because they were only in session for 15 minutes. Before voting unanimously that my parents should sell the house and move out. Today, the detective also called to give me an update. Toby's bail was revoked immediately. And this time there's no chance he'll get out. He'll have to stay in custody until trial. The prosecutor's office is treating this as proof that Toby poses a serious, ongoing threat. Finally, additional charges have been added to his record. And he'll now be facing a long list of criminal counts, including everything he did that night. The detective told me that his actions could add years to his sentence. And honestly, I feel good about that. Because not only will he be locked up for months awaiting trial, the odds are very high that he'll stay locked up long after that. I just hope it's for several years. This morning, my mother called again. She asked me to consider visiting them soon, to talk things out and rebuild our relationship. She said she and my father had been reading testimonies and online resources about stalking and domestic abuse, and that it helped them understand my side of things. She said they never want to make that mistake again. I told her it was funny she called, because I also never want to make that mistake again. And that mistake had names, my parents. Because I will never trust these people again. After what their recklessness caused. I know it's not nice to kick people when they're down. But at this point, I don't think they've fallen nearly far enough. But I don't know if this counts as kicking them while they're down. I'm just not helping them back up. The same way they didn't help me when I was the one on the ground, terrified because my ex wouldn't stop stalking me. Now they've been given a deadline to put their property up for sale and move out, since no one in the neighborhood wants them there anymore. And look, I'm not usually a fan of homeowners associations. They tend to have ridiculous rules. But in this case, what they're doing to my parents has actually helped bring us to this point. I think I might actually like this HOA. As for my parents, they'll have to sell in a bad market, with a damaged house. They can either choose to fix it up before selling, or leave it as is. But they need to be out of there before the deadline, whether the house sells or not. If they don't, they'll start receiving daily fines for every day they remain. Update 4. This one's a small update, shorter than what I usually write. Mostly because I don't have many new developments about Toby. I just wanted to give you an update on my parents from the past 2 months. As for Toby, there's now a trial date set. It'll take place next month. And I have no idea how long it'll last. There are too many charges, too much evidence, too many witnesses. I just want it over with as soon as possible. And when they finally lock him up, I want to throw the key into the ocean. I know I'm asking for a lot, but it's nice to fantasize about that. My parents have sold their house, according to what my old neighbor told me, since I've completely cut contact with them. My dad did a few simple repairs himself, But the kitchen and other parts of the house were sold as is. Obviously, the price they got was lower. But they needed the money to move. They couldn't afford rent, HOA dues, property taxes, and other costs while waiting for the market to recover. All I know is that they moved somewhere else within the city. Because the moving company they used was a local one. And I only know that because my ever-curious neighbor did her own investigation and called to give me the news. They moved out 2 days before the deadline. Cutting it close, but not close enough to risk penalties. My decision not to forgive my parents still stands. Unless they somehow get new neighbors who decide to play messenger. It's likely I won't hear from them again for a very long time. Yes, I'm aware that at some point they might try to repair our relationship. But I stand by what I said. I don't want anything to do with them. They took the side of my stalker, for God's sake. Update 5. Finally, I can give you what so many of you have been waiting for. A conclusion to Toby's trial and his sentencing. I waited until the appeal window had passed. And since my ex didn't file one, this sentence is now final. For stalking, destruction of my parents' property, and everything else he did within just a few weeks, Toby has been sentenced to 7 years in prison. That's a high sentence for these kinds of cases. But the recurring harassment, the overwhelming evidence, and the incident with my parents' house were more than enough for the judge to rule that he is a dangerous person. 7 years in which I can live peacefully. In which I can finally focus on myself. Without constantly wondering what he might do next. In 7 years, I'll have to think again about what precautions I'll need to take when he gets out. But for now, I can finally breathe. For the first time in what feels like forever. It's like I can stop holding my breath. Not anymore. Edit. No, my parents haven't contacted me. Not that I'd want them to. But as of now, I haven't heard anything more about them. And honestly, that's perfectly fine with me.